is a very extensive process that these standards have to go through in terms of drafting, committee review in order to get to a final version, because there is such an emphasis placed on the language, and because in effect these are enforced as laws in some regard, especially on the QSR side. So you need to pay attention to what the words are. And here they're kind of giving some very explicit definitions to some of these terms. When in the regulation you see the word shall, that indicates a requirement. And I think that you will hopefully gain an appreciation as we go through this process that there are not that many shalls, or probably far fewer than you think there are, as we go through the ISO standard. So anytime you see something referred to as a shall, that is a regulatory requirement. It is a must-have in your quality management system. Anytime you see something referred to as a should, that is simply a recommendation, probably a best practice, but not a requirement. And you should not, from an auditor, receive a non-conformance because you did not do something that the ISO standard identifies as a should. The term may indicates that you have permission from the regulation to perform a certain activity or respond in a certain way. And the term can indicates that something is a possibility or that a system is capable of performing a certain way. Now, whenever I'm reviewing regulations, as I'm reading through them, I am always paying very specific attention to the shalls. If you ignore the other three, I wouldn't recommend you ignore the other three, but if you can only focus in on one, you absolutely want to focus in on identifying everything in the regulation that is preceded by a shall, because that is ultimately where you are going to receive non-conformances in an audit if there is something identified as a shall that you have not accomplished within your quality management system. The other thing that I'll call your attention to here is 0.3, the process approach. This has been kind of a gradual shift over the last couple of decades in quality management systems, especially in the audit process or the way that notified bodies conduct their audits. But the process approach essentially means that they want you to view your quality management system in the terms of what are the inputs to a process, what is the process itself, and then what are the deliverables or what are the outputs of that process. And you should be able to string a thread through your entire organization that connects one process to the next. So for example, at the receiving dock, you would have a set of inputs, a process by which you receive materials in the back door. The outputs of that likely feed your receiving inspection process. So then the inputs to your receiving inspection process are the outputs of the preceding process, and you should be able to march through every process in your building all the way to the shipping of materials out the back of the facility. Knowing that process flow is what they're referring to in the process approach. And there's even language here, I'll see if I can find it very quickly, that you have to be able to identify and describe that process flow. Let me read it briefly and see. It might be a little bit further in the regulation here. I will find it. There's another kind of a bonus section here in the introduction where it talks about scope right here. This is where a lot of sites derive the ability to claim elements of the quality management system that are not applicable or excluded from their quality management system, specifically around design controls. For most sites within Viant, there are some sites that we have that do have design controls, but the majority of them claim an exclusion. And that your ability to do that is derived from this section here, the scope of the ISO standard. Right here, if applicable, regulatory requirements permit exclusions of design and development controls. Now, there is another term within the, I believe it's within the introduction, where it talks about the phrase where applicable. The regulators assume that all clauses are applicable to your organization unless you can provide a justification why they are not applicable. So the assumption is they are applicable until you can provide a justification that they're not. It is not the the burden does not reside on the regulators or the notified bodies to prove to us, the organization, that we have to comply with every element of the standard. The burden is on us to justify why we do not. But the language here in the scope of the ISO 13485 standard is where we have those allowances and the ability to provide those justifications. Beyond section 1, you get into normative references and then 3 terms and definitions. I'm not going to go through the terms and definitions, but I would encourage each of you to review them on your own. Again, as I said before, words really matter in these standards, and so knowing how specific terms and definitions are used, I'll give you a couple that I think are particularly good to know in detail. There is a definition for let me see if I can find it just quick. Medical device. You should know the ins and outs of the definition of a medical device as it pertains to the standard, because there is very specific language here. You should know what that is. You should be able, when you're talking with an inspector or an auditor and they refer to something as a medical device, they mean some very specific things, and you should know what it is that they're referring to, especially because the scope of what a medical device means in the regulated industry at large is a much broader definition than the way that we think about it within the 4 walls of most of the facilities within Viant. That being said, I am going to move forward to section 4, unless anybody has any of the topics around the introduction that they'd like me to go back and cover again in more detail. So I'll pause in case there's any questions.
Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Can you go back to the term that we just saw?
Yep. 1 second.
In the
there we
medical device. Yeah. When it says in the second line of the first paragraph, it says material or other similar or related article. What it means to or what is related article?
Instrument. In my interpretation, that's kind of like the other category. Anything, so they've made an attempt to list all the different things that could be a medical device. They've listed out instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, etc. Other similar or related article, in my mind, is kind of a catch-all that says any other thing that we didn't identify in this list but is intended by the manufacturer to be used alone in combination for human beings.
Okay, thank you.
It's a good question. Anybody else? Okay, we're going to move to section 4. Section 4 defines some general requirements about the quality management system. And as we go through this, you're going to see that a lot of what we're covering in section 4 is around general structure and the way that you construct your quality management system. Okay. And I am, as I said before, very much going to focus on the shalls. I am not going to read word for word what it says, but if there are things that are shalls, I am going to call attention to those. So 411, you shall have a quality management system. You shall establish, implement, and maintain the requirements or procedures that are required by this standard. And you shall document the roles that you function within under the standard. So let's talk about 411. What does that mean? You have to have a quality management system. That quality management system should cover all of the requirements in this standard, specifically for the roles that your organization functions. So if your organization is a manufacturer only and you do not do any design controls, then you have to have a quality system. It has to cover everything in this standard, but it does not have to include design controls. Taking those 3 shalls in total kind of help begin to frame out what your quality management system is going to look like at the very highest level. Okay. As we move into section 4.1.2, the organization shall determine the processes that are needed by the quality management system based on the role that your organization functions. So you have to go through the standard and decide for your organization which clauses you have to comply with, and then have justifications for the ones that you do not comply with. You should apply a risk-based approach to the control of those processes. Hopefully, the phrase risk-based approach is one that is very familiar to you. And if you've heard myself or other site quality leaders say that we're going to take a risk-based approach to how we handle various problems within the organization, especially as we're moving things through the quality management system, there is a direct requirement in the ISO standard that says you should be using a risk-based approach in that decision-making process. And then you shall determine the sequence and interactions of the processes within your quality management system. So if you'll remember, I said in the introduction that it says you have to have a process-based approach. You have to understand what the inputs, the process, and the outputs are for every step of your organization. This is saying that within your quality management system, you need to be able to determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. Now, most of you likely have seen a visual process flow map that usually looks something to the effect of a circle with two boxes on either end. And on one side, you've probably got something that says like user needs or design inputs. And the box on the far right says things like customer feedback or quality data. And then within the circle in the middle, you've got things like design controls, manufacturing, that kind of flow chart of what most of the quality system processes are. But you also frequently will see process flows for the actual processes within the facility. Frequently, you will see one and or both of those in the quality manual, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But that's one of the ways that most organizations demonstrate conformity to this particular section. This 4.1.2c, determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. That flow chart is very, very common in terms of how people demonstrate compliance to that part of the standard. Before I move on, that's 4.1.1 and 4.1.2. Any questions before I move on to 4.1.3? I realize I'm going quickly, but I want to make sure we have time for questions. Okay. So 4.1.2, saying that let me kind of summarize. Point 1.1 says you're going to have a quality system, and that quality system is going to cover everything in this standard that applies to your organization. 4.1.2 is going to say that you need to determine for yourself the processes that are going to be included in your quality system, have justifications when you don't include those processes, and be able to describe how those processes all interact with each other. As we move into 4.1.3, the quality management system, there are a few shalls here. You shall determine the methods to ensure the operation and control of your processes is effective, to ensure the availability of information and resources for those processes. You need to have a plan to achieve desired results and be able to maintain the effectiveness of those processes to achieve those results, monitor and measure the processes, and then you're going to establish records to demonstrate conformance. So hopefully you're starting to see that this first section of the regulation is kind of building their building blocks, right? Point 1.1 says you're going to have a quality system, and it's got to be appropriate to the roles that your organization serves. Well, those roles will define the types of processes that your site performs. And so your quality management system has to include those processes, and you have to justify when you don't include them. And you have to determine the sequence of all of those processes. Well, the next building block here, which they're kind of describing through each of these bullets, is now that you've got those processes, they need to be effective. And you need to ensure that you can maintain their effectiveness over time. No point in having defined all these processes if they don't work. So what 4.1.3 is saying is that you need to know the criteria to ensure that the control of these processes are effective. Make sure you've got the right resources to make them effective, that they can be effective over time based on your planning and your monitoring of those processes. And then you will create records to demonstrate conformance of those processes to the standard. So we've now added the third building block that says this is the structure of our quality system and how we maintain it over time. Now we're going to add another building block. We're adding 4.1.4. 4.1.4 says, now that you've built this quality system with those three major building blocks, you need to be careful about making changes. You went to all of that work to build this quality system that was effective, and you had the right resources, and it had the right scope, and the process flow was mapped out, and you can demonstrate that those processes are effective. But once you start to change things, you don't want to break your systems. You don't want to break your processes. So when you make changes to the quality system, they must be evaluated for their impact on the quality management system. You want to make sure that if you change a very specific process or procedure, again, if you picture all of these things being linked together, you want to make sure you don't break the links in the chain because of the changes that you made to a process or a procedure. So you evaluate all your changes based on their impact to the quality management system. The other evaluation that you have to do as part of 4.1.4 is you have to evaluate the impact on the medical devices themselves. Now remember, medical devices has a very, very specific definition within the ISO standard. So we're not just talking about the physical medical device that you might be able to hold in your hand. There's a lot of different things that can be considered a medical device within this sentence. But you have to make sure that the changes that you make to your quality system are not going to have an adverse effect on the quality management system or the devices that you are producing within this quality management system. And then part C here just says that you will control those changes in accordance with the requirements of this standard. And the requirements of the standard for controlling changes is pretty close to follow here in the standard. 4.1.5 is pretty straightforward. It says that if you decide to outsource any of those processes associated with your medical device, remember, we've got all these processes mapped out, and maybe we don't perform all of those processes within our organization. Maybe we've contracted service providers or contract manufacturers or other organizations that are going to do some of this work for us. Even if you choose to outsource that work, you still have to maintain control over those processes. You're still responsible for the conformity to the standard. You're still responsible for the risk associated with the work that is done by those service providers. And you need to put controls on those service providers. But in the last sentence there, it's the second to last sentence, it says that those controls should be proportionate to the risk involved in the ability of the external party to meet the requirements. So we could talk quite a bit about this. I'm going to try and be brief because we're going to come back to this clause when we start talking about supplier evaluation and monitoring, because a lot of the requirements in supplier evaluation and monitoring are derived originally from this clause here in 4.1.5. But if you can demonstrate that there is very low risk that a supplier is going to provide you non-conforming product or not be compliant to the standard requirements, then you do not have to put a lot of controls on that supplier. But if you cannot demonstrate, or you demonstrate the alternative, which is you have evidence to demonstrate that that supplier represents a high risk that they would provide you with non-conforming product, or there is a high risk that they cannot maintain conformance to this standard, then you must implement additional controls on that service provider, because ultimately you as the organization are responsible for the outputs of that service provider that you bring into your process. Lastly, the controls that you implement on that service provider are included in written quality agreements. So if you are not part of the quality agreement process with virtually all of our customers, we have quality agreements in place that define what types of controls they put on us as a contract manufacturer in order to monitor and control our performance from a conformity standpoint. And in some cases, we have quality agreements with our suppliers where we do the same thing. We define controls that we put on our suppliers in order to maintain or reduce the risk that we perceive associated with those suppliers. So we'll talk more about this when we get into the purchasing section of the ISO standard, but just know that this is the first area where we start to see that notion of supplier controls within the ISO standard. Okay, 4.1.6, it simply says that the organization is going to document procedures for the validation of software, but there's a specific scope that we're calling out here. Remember, section 4 is talking about the structure of your quality management system as a whole. So 4.1.6 is talking about the application of computer software used in the quality management system. Software applications have to be validated. If you have a software that you use for your quality management system, for example, master control, this clause says that you have to validate that software and that you have to revalidate that software based on the risk associated with that software and when you make changes to it, etc. So this is not necessarily a blanket software validation requirement, but it is a requirement specifically for quality management system software. Okay, so we've got all the structure or the bones of the quality management system defined. Now we are going to be moving into section 4.2, documentation requirements. Okay, the general requirements are relatively straightforward. It says that you're going to have a quality policy and you will have quality objectives. Now, most of you hopefully are familiar with Viant's quality policy. We do have a slide that pretty explicitly says what our quality policy is. There are some things that you are required to have in your quality policy that we'll talk about a little bit later. You also have to have quality objectives. So if I was going to point to something as the quality objectives in an audit, there are a few things that I typically point an auditor towards in order to demonstrate that we are conforming to this part of the standard. Your tier 1 metrics, meaning the metrics we have around complaint rate, non-conformance rate, and CAPA aging, those are the easiest things to point to that demonstrate that the organization has quality objectives for the organization. Okay. Another thing that you could potentially point to for quality objectives are if you have strategic quality initiatives for the year. I know that many of the sites have an X matrix that identify specific things that they are doing with regards to quality projects. Those are things that you could point to with regards to quality objectives, but in my experience, they really want to see things that are quantifiable metrics, right? You could also point to the quality dashboard that we review on a monthly basis that includes the tier 1 metrics, but it also includes some other information as well. You could point to those as quality objectives as well. Line item B says that you're going to have a quality manual, so that's why we have a quality manual. Line item C says that you will have documented procedures and records that are required by this international standard, and it's in the remainder of the standard, it's going to identify what those procedures and records are in addition to the ones that it described above. And that you're going to have documents, including records, that are necessary to ensure planning, operation, and control of the processes. So if you'll remember, in section 4.1.3, go back to it real quick, it says that you are going to determine the criteria and methods needed to ensure the operation and control of your processes. Now we're saying that we are going to document those activities. We are going to include records that ensure that the planning, operation, and control of our processes is effective and working as it's intended to. And you're going to see this concept happen over and over again in terms of documentation and records. When the ISO standard lays out a set of expectations for what you shall do, it expects that you will document both in terms of procedures and in terms of records that you are conforming to the standard. And when you think about them, I want you to think about them in this context. A procedure says what we are going to do. A record confirms that we did it. Okay, so, and you'll see that happen over and over in the standard. Procedures say what we're going to do. A record confirms that we did what we said we were going to do. This line item E here, other documentation specified by applicable regulatory requirements. There are other regulatory requirements outside of ISO 13485. So this is simply stating that you will have documentation that is required by those other standards as well. Okay, moving into the specifics of the quality manual 4.2.2, the organization shall document a quality manual, and that quality manual will include the scope of the quality management system, So again, going back to the building blocks that we started with in the introduction and in the earlier parts of section 4, there are portions of the standard that may not be applicable to your quality system. So the scope of your quality manual should identify anything that you are excluding or considering non-applicable, and you'll see it here, justification for why you're excluding it. Remember, the burden is on the organization to prove why they do not have to apply, or to prove why something is not applicable. Otherwise, the assumption is that it is applicable to your organization. I have seen sites get nonconformances because their quality manual did not make the appropriate exclusions. The notified body expects to see certain procedures for those elements of the quality management system. And when we say, well, we don't do those functions here, or that's not part of our business, you will still get a nonconformance if your quality manual doesn't explicitly provide those justifications and claim those exclusions. So this is an important clause in the quality manual. The other thing your quality manual is going to have is reference to the procedures that govern the QMS. So pointers to all of the different processes and procedures that build out the structure. And then a description of the interaction between the processes. Remember, this again is another recurring theme. This is that flow chart that I was talking about that most people include in their quality manual that describes the interaction of all the processes of the quality management system. Okay, 4.2.3. Let's talk about the shalls in 4.2.3. You're going to have a medical device file for every device type or every device family, and it's going to include a description of the device, the intended use, the labeling, the instructions for use. These are things that we associate with, claims or indications about the medical device. Oftentimes, these are some of what you would consider the portion of the FDA's definition of a medical device where it talks about the intent to market a device. These are the elements that often are included in that marketing of a device. You're also going to include in that file specifications for the product, specifications for the manufacturing process itself, including things like packaging, storage, handling, and distribution. You're going to have procedures for measuring and monitoring not only the device, but your processes. And you're going to have, where appropriate, requirements for installation and servicing, which in most cases does not apply to Viant organizations, but there are a few pockets where I think it does apply. So let me kind of scroll back up here a little bit. Up until this point in the introduction in section 4, we've been talking about all the documentation that describes your quality management system itself, okay? 4.2.3 represents a little bit of a shift in the conversation within the regulation, because now we're talking about things that go into your quality management system. But this is not the structure of your quality management system itself. This is the structure of your medical device file. You might also hear this referred to as technical documentation. Historically, under MDD, we would call this the technical file or the technical dossier. You might hear in FDA arenas, you might hear this referred to as the device history file. Essentially, this is the repository where all of the procedures and specifications associated with a particular medical device reside. Now, we take all of those documents and we put them into our quality management system through our document control process. And you will see that the document control process is the very next section of the standard. So any questions about any of that before I move into 4.2.4? Okay, we'll keep going. Control of documents. Again, we're going to focus in on the areas where it tells us what we shall do. So there's a lot here, but when you break it down, it's pretty straightforward, and it's things that you do every day. You're going to review and approve documents before they get used or before they're implemented. And you're going to review them again, change them, and reapprove them whenever necessary. You're going to make sure that we're using the current revision. You're going to make sure that the current revision is available at the point of use, meaning that if you're talking about production work instructions, that those work instructions are available on the production floor. Or if you're talking about your CAPA procedure, that the individuals that perform a CAPA have access to your CAPA procedure. You ensure that they remain legible and identifiable. So in your organization, the requirement that things be done in pen, if they're handwritten, comes from this remain legible. That's one of the ways that organizations demonstrate that procedures and records are legible over time and readily identifiable. So we have document numbers, procedure numbers that kind of help drive that readily identifiable requirement along with the titles of the documents themselves. So you're going to ensure that documents of an external origin, think of things like a customer specification, that those documents are also going to be controlled. They're going to be moved into our quality system so that we can identify them and control their distribution, and that we can control revisions of those documents moving through our quality system. We're going to prevent deterioration or loss of the documents and the unintended use of obsolete documents. So all of those common things that you see around document control, this is where they are explicitly called out in the ISO standard. We're going to ensure that changes are reviewed and approved by the original approving function. Now, it's important that you note here that it says the original function and not the original person. And what they're trying to drive with this clause of the regulation is, when you originally approved, we'll use a validation as an example. When you originally approved a validation, if you included engineering, quality, regulatory affairs, operations, and R&D, if you have an organization where sustaining engineering and R&D engineering are separate functions, then if you make changes to that validation, all those same functional areas should be part of the re-review and approval process. When you make a change to one of those validations, you can't just route it through quality and engineering, have those two signatures approve the change, and then move the document to a released version. You have to maintain the same level of review that you had when you released the document for the first time. That doesn't mean that it has to be the same person, just the same functional area. But if you have two different people in the same functional area, they have to have, and here it is here, access to the pertinent background information in order to make good decisions. So what does that mean? It means that if I am the engineer on a specific customer's product line, and we route the original version of a validation, and then we're going to route changes to that validation, and you go find another engineer from another manufacturing line, that is not an appropriate function to approve that validation, because I may not have access to the pertinent background information in order to base decisions. Now, I'll give you another example. If I'm the engineer on a manufacturing line and I leave the organization and another engineer is hired to take my place, and they are now the engineer on that manufacturing line, even though it's a different person, that new engineer is the appropriate function to sign off for engineering, because they will have access to all of the background information because they are now the engineer on that manufacturing line. Okay, and then this last paragraph here is around, I'm going to scroll back and show you, this is control of documents. Think of documents like procedures. This last paragraph here is talking about retention, that you're going to have a defined period where you have copies of obsolete procedures that you retain, and it needs to ensure that documents associated with medical devices, if I could summarize it this way, when it comes to retention for both procedures and records, the expectation is that for the life of every medical device that you have out in the field, if required to, you could completely recreate a past version of your quality system that corresponded to the date that that device was manufactured, from top to bottom. You should be able to create your entire quality management system, which is the how we're going to do it, and you should be able to retrieve all of the records that confirm that you did it the way you were going to do it. So we should be able to pick a date in the last 2 to 5 years and say, okay, everybody, we are going to recreate our organization on paper as of February 16th, 2020. And we should be able to use our document control system to pull all the procedures, and given a lot number that was manufactured on February 16th, 2020, be able to retrieve all of the records to, almost like a snapshot or a picture, recreate our entire organization on paper on that date. That is the intent of document retention and record retention. Okay, so now that we've talked about how we're going to control documents, which is the how we do things in our quality system, now we're going to talk about in 4.2.5 control of records, which is confirming that we did what we said we were going to do. These records are going to be maintained to demonstrate conformity and effective operation of the quality system. They shall document the procedures to maintain the integrity, storage, I'll show it to you right here, controls needed for the identification of storage, security, integrity, retrieval, and retention, again, so that we could recreate our quality system if we needed to. We're going to protect confidential health information, which does not normally apply to our organization as a contract manufacturer. This is essentially a reference to HIPAA requirements around patient privacy and safety of patient information in health records. Records shall remain legible. That's where the pay comes from. Readily identifiable, so they have to have titles and document numbers. They have to be retrievable. Changes to a record shall remain identifiable. That's where we get the requirement for when you are changing something on a record, you do the strike through with the initial and date as opposed to just scribbling it out. Changes to a record shall remain identifiable is where that requirement is derived from. And then again, in the same way that we retain procedures or documents, we are going to retain these records at least for the lifetime of the medical device, but for not less than 2 years, with the intent, again, that we could recreate our quality system at some date in the past in order to demonstrate conformity of a specific medical device that was manufactured on a specific date. And with that, we complete section 4 of the ISO regulation. So I'm going to stop there. I will open it up for questions. Again, I would encourage everybody to read through the ISO standard on your own. I kind of went very quickly through a number of clauses, really just trying to focus in on the shalls. But there is a lot of information in the ISO regulation beyond just the shalls of the regulation that I would encourage you to read for yourself. And then certainly if you have any questions, the Quality Communications Teams group is a fantastic place to drop those questions so that myself and others in the organization can offer our perspective on those questions. But I did manage to finish with 10 minutes to spare, so I'm happy to open it up at this point in case anybody has any questions about anything that we covered.
Hi, Brian, this is Arjun. Quick
Hey,
question regarding security. What is the intent behind, or what do they mean by specifically security in the last clause?
In the last, you're talking about the document procedures. Let me find it. The health information security, is that what you're talking about?
It's the second sentence.
Oh, right here, security. Okay, so records specifically are expected to be housed in a secure location, meaning not everybody has access to it. So wherever you keep your records that demonstrate conformity for medical devices to all of the specifications you've lined out, that should be a restricted access location. It should be a locked cabinet. It might be a locked closet, but it is not supposed to be open access. The intent is to prevent people from inadvertently damaging records, losing records, intentionally removing records. It is part of the control of records piece, and that security is the physical control of records, Arjun.
Thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you do think of something, again, feel free to email me or reach out to me in Teams directly to pose your question, or I would again encourage everybody to pose your questions in the Teams group, because I promise if you have a question, there are other people on this call that probably have the exact same question. We can keep the conversation going around the introduction in section 4 of the ISO standard. We'll probably continue on with section 5 in the next training that we have here in a couple of weeks. I recognize that being on a call for an hour as we trudge through page by page, the ISO regulation is not the most glamorous or entertaining type of training that we could do. And I recognize that this is very information intense, but it is intended to kind of build a strong foundation within our quality group of our knowledge and understanding of the ISO regulation. So hopefully you find it valuable and instructive. And you know, as long as people continue to think that we're adding value with this type of training, going through the ISO standard in this level of depth and detail, I'm happy to continue to move through the rest of the ISO standard. So I'll look for folks in the Teams group to leave feedback about whether or not they thought it was too deep into the weeds of the standard and we need to be a little bit higher level, or any combination in between, and I can try and adjust the training going forward accordingly. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.